The reins were colder than she remembered, and the leather cut a thin, honest line across the inside of her glove where the seam had worn through. She tightened her grip anyway. Above her, the lanterns of the inn yard guttered in a wind that smelled of wet straw and wood smoke. And somewhere behind the kitchen wall, a dog was barking at nothing in particular, the way dogs do when they sense a household holding its breath. She had perhaps 4 minutes, maybe 5 if the steward stopped to argue with the cook again about the price of partridges. 4 minutes to climb onto the high seat of her husband's traveling carriage, settle the heavy driver's cloak over her shoulders, pull the wide brim of the hat low across her eyes, and become, for one night only, a man she had never been and would never be again. She had practiced the voice for a week. Low in the throat, few words. Yes, Your Grace. No, Your Grace. Whatever Your Grace pleases. The trick, she had decided, was not to deepen the voice, but to take all the music out of it, the way a cellist mutes a string with the flat of the hand. She had practiced it in the long gallery while the portraits of his ancestors looked down with the same polite, uninterested expressions they wore for everything. They had not seemed shocked. Perhaps they had seen worse. Perhaps, she thought, climbing now onto the driver's box with the kind of small grunt she would not have permitted herself in any drawing room in the country. Perhaps they had seen exactly this. The horses shifted under her, 2 great bay geldings that knew their work better than most men knew their own marriages, and she felt the carriage settle, ready, as if it had merely been waiting for someone to take the question seriously. From inside the inn came the warm yellow noise of laughter. His laughter. The particular pitched laugh he kept for company that flattered him. She had heard that laugh through 3 drawing-room doors and across 4 dinner tables, and she had learned to recognize it the way a shepherd learns the cough of a particular sheep. It was not a cruel sound. It was worse than cruel. It was sincere. She drew the collar higher. The kitchen door banged. A boy ran out with a covered basket and lashed it to the rear with the quick, uninterested competence of someone who had been told there would be an extra coin in it for him if he did not look. He did not look. He glanced up at the driver only once, and she lowered her chin and gave him the smallest nod a person can give and still be said to have moved at all. He nodded back. He vanished. She allowed herself one breath, and it shook coming out of her. And that annoyed her, because she had decided earlier in the afternoon, while pinning her hair flat under the cap, that she would not permit herself any breath that shook. She had decided a great many things that afternoon. She had decided, for instance, that she was not a fool. She had decided that the letter she had found tucked behind the silver salt cellar was not addressed to her by accident. She had decided that whoever had placed it there, whether a servant with a grievance or a friend with a conscience, or, more likely, an enemy with patience, had done her a favor she did not yet know how to repay. And she had decided, finally, and without any of the long hand-wringing she had once believed such a decision required, that she would drive the carriage herself. Not confront him, not weep at him, not write the kind of letter that ladies in her position were supposed to write and then burn before morning. Drive the carriage. Hear what he said when he believed no one of consequence could hear him. She had been told all her life that she was not a woman of consequence. She had agreed for a long time out of politeness. She did not agree any longer. The inn door opened. He came out first, as he always did, brushing something invisible from the sleeve of his coat with that small, fastidious gesture she had once found charming and now found instructive. Behind him, in a cloak the color of claret left too long in the decanter, came the woman. She was younger than the Duchess by perhaps 5 years, and prettier than the Duchess by, the Duchess admitted to herself with the steady honesty of a bookkeeper closing a ledger, perhaps a great deal. It did not matter. Prettier was not the question. The question was the letter behind the salt cellar. And the question was the laugh through the drawing room doors. And the question was the 4 minutes that had now become 2. He handed the woman up into the carriage with a courtesy so practiced it looked almost tender. Then he climbed in after her, and the carriage rocked, and the door closed, and a small brass latch clicked. And the duchess of a house she had married into at 19 and had been quietly ignored within ever since, took up the reins of her husband's traveling carriage and clicked her tongue, very softly, the way the head groom had taught her when she was a child of 7 on a pony too large for her. And the horses, who had no opinions about marriages, stepped forward into the dark. The road out of the village climbed by a series of patient curves between low stone walls that someone, long ago, had built without mortar and that had remained standing anyway, which she thought, just then, was the best argument for stubbornness she had ever encountered. The lanterns on the carriage threw 2 pale yellow ovals onto the road ahead, and the ovals slid together and apart with the rhythm of the wheels, and she found, to her quiet surprise, that her hands had stopped trembling. They had work to do. They had taken the work. Trembling was a luxury for hands without employment. Inside the carriage, behind her and a little below, the voices began. At first she could not make out the words, only the shape of them, the rise and fall, the small punctuations of laughter. She had expected that. She had chosen this particular carriage in part because she knew its sounds. The way the left rear spring creaked at any pace above a walk. The way the small forward window, the one meant for speaking to the driver, was not as tightly fitted as the Duke believed it to be. She had noticed that window 3 winters ago, when a draft had cut across her ankles all the way to the coast, and she had said nothing, because she had learned by then that mentioning a draft to her husband was a way of inviting a lecture on the construction of carriages, and she had not been in the mood for lectures on the construction of carriages, and was not in the mood now, and never would be, she suspected, again. She slowed the horses to a walk. She had a long night ahead, and she did not wish to arrive anywhere too soon. She wished, in fact, to arrive nowhere at all, and only to drive, and to listen, until she had heard enough to decide what kind of woman she intended to be by morning. The voices sharpened. She could hear his now, the particular cadence of it, that confiding tone he used when he believed himself to be charming and was, in fact, only being heard. He was speaking of someone called Cecily, which was not the name of the woman beside him, and was not her name either, and which, she realized after a moment of careful arithmetic, was the name of a horse he had bought the previous spring for a sum she had not been told, and had only learned about by reading, very slowly, the bill from the dealer that had been left, perhaps not entirely by accident, in the morning room. He was praising the horse. The woman beside him laughed. A low, warm laugh that was, the Duchess noted with a curious absence of feeling, a perfectly nice laugh. There was nothing wrong with it. It was the laugh of a woman who had been told, often and credibly, that her laugh was charming. The Duchess felt, briefly and without bitterness, that she would have liked to have been told such a thing once or twice in her life. She had been told instead that she was sensible. She had been told that she was suitable. She had been told, on the morning of her wedding, by an aunt who meant well, that she was lucky. She had agreed with the aunt because the aunt had been crying. She had not, she realized now, agreed with the aunt since. The carriage took the long curve by the old chapel, where the road dipped and the wind off the field shifted and brought with it the smell of cut hay and damp stone. And the small forward window, the one her husband did not know, rattled, and through it she heard him say, very clearly, as if he had leaned forward to deliver the line and meant it to carry, "My dear, you must allow me to drink your health." there was a small sound of glass which surprised her, because she had not known he had brought glasses. He had brought glasses. Of course he had brought glasses. She almost laughed, and then she did laugh, once, under the brim of her hat. A sound so small the horses did not hear it. He had brought glasses. He had planned the toast. He had rehearsed it, perhaps, the way she had rehearsed her voice. They were, she thought, more alike than either of them had ever cared to admit. The difference, only and entirely, was that he had rehearsed in front of a mirror, and she had rehearsed in front of the portraits, and the portraits, in the end, had given better advice. "To your eyes," he said, and she heard the glasses touch, a small bright sound like a coin dropped on marble. "And to the kindness of fortune that arranged for me to find them across a room I had not wished to enter." She had not wished to enter that room either, she remembered. It had been a card party at a house she did not like, given by a woman she trusted less than she liked her, and she had gone because the Duke had wished to be seen there, and being seen there had required a wife, and she had been, that year as every year, the wife in question. She had stood by the fire for most of the evening because the fire was the only honest thing in the room, and she had spoken little because she had nothing she wished to say to anyone present. She had watched her husband cross the room 3 times to fetch wine he did not drink, and she had understood, without making any fuss about understanding, that he was crossing the room to be seen crossing it by a particular pair of eyes in a particular corner. She had not, at the time, identified the eyes. She had thought it beneath her to look. She regretted that now, mildly, the way one regrets not having taken an umbrella. The woman in the carriage said something the Duchess could not quite catch, and the Duke laughed his sincere laugh, and then he said, and here the Duchess slowed the horses a little further, because she wished to hear this clearly. "My wife, you understand, is a very good woman." There was a pause. The Duchess waited for the rest. There is always a rest after such a sentence. "A very good woman, but..." "A very good woman, however." "A very good woman, and yet..." He chose, after consideration, "And yet..." "A very good woman," he said, "and yet not a woman, if you take my meaning, of any particular weather." The woman in the carriage laughed, gently as if she were not certain she was meant to. He warmed to it. "She is," he said, "a fair day in a country with no seasons. One is grateful, of course. One does not complain of a fair day. But one does not," he said, "write poems about it." The Duchess held the reins. The horses, sensing nothing of any of this, walked on. She found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she was not angry. She was something else. She was, she decided after a moment of careful internal inquiry, interested. She was interested in the man who had just said that about her. She was interested in the woman who had laughed at it. She was interested, most of all, in herself, in the very good woman with no particular weather who was at this moment driving them both down a dark road with a hand that did not tremble and a voice she had practiced for a week, and a letter, folded twice, inside the lining of her coat. A fair day, she thought. Very well. She had never minded fair days. She had, in fact, always rather liked them. She had liked their evenness, their refusal to make a fuss. She had liked that they did not demand to be written about. She had liked that they got things done. Bread was baked on fair days, roofs were mended on fair days, children learned to ride on fair days. Storms, in her experience, mostly broke things. She let the horses lengthen their stride a little. There was a long, straight stretch ahead between 2 hedgerows that had been let grow tall, and the moon, which had been considering the matter for some time, finally committed to the sky and laid down a thin silver light along the road. He was talking again. He was telling the woman about a house. He had, it seemed, a house in mind for her. A small one, very pretty, with a garden, in a part of the country where he was unlikely to be seen by anyone who would carry the news home. He named the village. The Duchess knew the village. She knew, in fact, the house. It was a house her own grandmother had once lived in as a girl, before her grandmother had married up and out and into the world that had eventually produced the Duchess herself. The Duchess had visited that house twice in her life. She remembered the kitchen garden, which was south-facing and obliging, and the well, which was deep and cold, and the small parlor, where there had been a clock that struck the hour with a soft, apologetic note, as if it did not wish to interrupt. She had loved that clock. She had loved the village. She had not known, until this moment, that the house was for sale, or that her husband had bought it, or that he had bought it for this purpose. She filed each of these facts away with the calm of a woman organizing her linen cupboard. She did not slam any drawers. She closed them all, neatly, one after another. There would be time, later, to take everything out again and look at it in daylight. The road forked. She took the longer way without hesitation. She had decided, somewhere between the chapel and the hedgerow, that this carriage would not arrive at any inn that night. It would drive. It would drive for as long as the horses could comfortably bear it, and then it would stop in a place of her choosing, not his, and the doors would open, and the night would do what the night did. She did not yet know what the night would do. She trusted the night to know its own business. The wind came up against them as they crested the small rise above the river, and she had to lean into it, the heavy cloak pulling at her shoulders, the hat brim threatening to lift. And she pressed her chin down and kept her hands quiet and let the horses find their own rhythm down the long slope toward the bridge. The bridge was old and narrow and made a particular sound under wheels, a deep, low thrum that came up through the boards into the bones of the carriage, and she felt that sound enter her chest and settle there, steady as a second heartbeat. Below the bridge, the river ran black and fast, full from the recent rains, and she could hear it muttering to itself the way rivers do at night, as if it were rehearsing a complaint it intended to deliver to the sea. Inside the carriage there was a small lull. He had finished, for the moment, with houses. The woman had asked him something the Duchess could not catch, and the Duke had answered with a long considered silence, the kind of silence he used in the house when he wished to be thought to be weighing matters of state, and which the Duchess had long ago identified, in private, as the silence of a man waiting for an answer to occur to him. When the answer occurred to him, he gave it. He said, "You must not think me unkind. I am not unkind. I have never, in all the years of our marriage, raised my voice to her. I have never struck her. I have never," he said, with a small flourish of self-approval that the Duchess could hear as clearly as if he had drawn it in chalk on the inside of the window, "denied her any pleasure she has thought to ask for. The trouble," he said, "is that she has never thought to ask." There was a pause. The woman, to her credit, did not laugh this time. The Duchess found herself rather warming to the woman, in a distant, professional way, the way one might warm to a competent stranger encountered on a long journey. The woman said, very quietly, "Perhaps she has asked, Your Grace, and you have not heard her." The Duchess almost dropped the reins. She did not. Her hands were better than that. But something inside her, some small held thing that had been held for so long she had forgotten she was holding it, loosened a single notch. "Perhaps she has asked, and you have not heard her." The Duke did not like the sentence. The Duchess could hear that he did not like it. There was a small, careful clearing of the throat, the sound he made when he was about to be charming at someone in a way intended to close a subject. "My dear," he said, You must not trouble yourself with the inner life of duchesses. It is, I assure you, a very thin volume." He laughed at his own line. The woman did not. The Duchess approved. The horses approved in their way by maintaining their pace. The bridge ended. The road bent left along the river, and the trees closed in over them, and for a little while the only sounds were the wheels and the river and the small, thin music of harness. The Duke, who could not bear silence for long when he believed himself to be in company that needed entertaining, began to speak again, and this time he spoke of his wife by name. "Eleanor," he said, and the Duchess, hearing her own name in his mouth in that tone, felt for the first time that night a small, clean stab of something she could honestly identify as anger, and was almost relieved to feel it, because she had been beginning to wonder whether she had any feelings left at all. "Eleanor," he said, "is the daughter of a very respectable house, and a very respectable house, my dear, is like a very respectable wine. One serves it at dinners one wishes to seem proper. One does not, however, take it to a picnic." The woman said, in a voice that had grown noticeably cooler, "You speak of your wife as if she were a bottle." The Duke laughed. "I speak of everyone," he said, "as if they were a bottle. It is the only honest way to take stock of a cellar." The Duchess, on the driver's box, with the moon now fully committed and laying its silver hand along the river, said to herself, quite calmly, "Very well. Very well, Your Grace. I am a bottle. Let us see, then, what is in me." She clicked her tongue. The horses lifted their pace. She did not snap the reins. She did not need to. They knew her. They had always known her. She had ridden their mother before either of them was foaled. They had been, in their quiet animal way, the only members of the household who had never required her to pretend. She turned them down a side lane that did not appear on any map the Duke would have consulted. A track that ran between two long fields and emerged, eventually, at a place she had decided upon earlier in the day, without quite admitting to herself that she had decided. It was an open meadow above a low cliff, a place where the river turned in a long, lazy curve, and the land fell away into a soft hollow full of mist. She had picnicked there as a child. She had been told, by a governess with a romantic streak, that it was a place where one could think clearly. She had not, at the time, had much to think about. She had now rather a lot. The lane was rougher than the road. The carriage jolted. Inside, the Duke made a small sound of irritation, and then, after a moment, the sharp rap of his stick against the roof, twice, the signal she had seen him give to drivers all her married life and had never, until tonight, been on the receiving end of. "Driver," he called. "Driver, what road is this?" She did not answer. She had practiced not answering. It was, of all the things she had practiced, the easiest. The stick rapped again, harder. "Driver!" The Duchess pulled the horses to a walk, but she did not stop. She let the carriage continue, slow and steady, along the lane, and she let the silence on the box do its work. She had learned, over many years of dinners, that a silence held long enough became a kind of speech, and that the person who could hold it longest generally won the conversation, whether or not anything had been said. The Duke could not hold a silence. He had many gifts, and she had, in her fairer moods, acknowledged them. Silence was not among them. After a moment he rapped again, and then, when she still did not answer, he opened the small forward window himself, the one he believed to be tightly fitted, and the cold air of the meadow came into the carriage, and his voice came out of it, sharper now, with the edge he used on footmen who had failed to anticipate him. "I asked you a question," he said. "Where are we?" She had a choice then. She could continue not to answer, and let the silence carry them further into the meadow, where the road ended at the edge of the cliff, and the carriage would have to stop because the land itself stopped. Or she could answer in the voice she had practiced, the flat, musicless voice, and buy herself a little more time. She had not, until that moment, been certain which she would do. She found that she had chosen somehow, without consulting herself. She answered. "Your Grace," she said, in the flat voice, "the shortcut, by the upper meadow. We shall rejoin the post road past the mill." There was a pause. She could feel him considering the voice. She had not, perhaps, done it perfectly. She had practiced for a week, but a week is a short time, and a husband, even an inattentive one, has heard his wife's voice every day for years. And a voice is a fingerprint with weather in it. He hesitated. She heard the hesitation. Then he said, with a kind of impatient dismissal, "Very well, but mind the ruts." And he closed the window again, and the woman beside him said something low, and he answered with a short laugh, and the conversation resumed, although, the Duchess noted, in a slightly altered key. The toast had been broken. He had not yet drunk his wife's health, and now he would not, because the rhythm had gone out of the evening, and the Duke was a man who required rhythm to be charming. She did not mind. She had not wished to be toasted. She had wished to be heard, and she had been, by the woman in the carriage, in a single sentence. And that, she thought, was a great deal more than she had expected to receive on any night of her life. And she would take it, and she would not be greedy. She drove on. The lane narrowed. The hedgerow on the right gave way to a long, low wall of stones, and beyond the wall the meadow opened, silver under the moon, and the mist lay along the hollow like a soft second river. And somewhere, a long way off, an owl announced itself with the brisk efficiency of a man calling the next case in court. She brought the horses to a halt. She did it gently, the way she had been taught, easing them down through a slow walk into stillness, and she set the brake, and she sat for a moment with the reins in her hands and her eyes on the moon, and she allowed herself, finally, one of the breaths she had earlier forbidden, a long, shaking one that emptied her chest of something she had not realized she had been carrying. Then she climbed down from the box. She did not climb down the way a duchess climbs down from anything, which is to say with assistance and apologies. She climbed down the way the headgroom had taught her to climb down when she was 7. Hand to rail, foot to step, weight kept over the wheel. She landed in the wet grass with a small, soft sound. She walked, without hurry, to the door of the carriage. She paused there. She listened. Inside, the Duke was in the middle of a story she had heard him tell 3 times before, about a horse he had not in fact owned, and a wager he had not in fact won. And the woman was making the small, polite sounds of a listener who had begun to suspect that the story was longer than the evening. The Duchess took off the hat. She took off the heavy driver's cloak and folded it neatly over her arm. She smoothed her hair, which had been pinned flat all evening, and which protested, mildly, the way hair does when reminded of its own existence. She straightened the collar of the dress underneath, a plain dark traveling dress she had chosen because it would not show against the box. She took the letter out of the lining. She held it in her hand. She did not look at it. She knew what it said. She had read it, the first time, in the morning room, by the window, with the light coming in over her shoulder, and she had read it a second time in her own bedroom, by candle, and she had read it a third time that afternoon while pinning her hair, and she had not needed after the third time to read it again. She knocked once on the carriage door. Inside, the story stopped. There was a pause of exactly the length she had expected. Then the Duke, in the voice he used for inconveniences, said, "What is it now?" She opened the door. She did not open it dramatically. She opened it the way she opened the doors of her own house, which is to say, with the quiet competence of a woman who has been opening doors all her life. She stood in the doorway. The moon was behind her, and she knew, because she had thought about this earlier in the evening, that her face would be in shadow for a moment before they understood. She gave them the moment. She did not wish to cheat anyone of the chance to arrive at the truth in their own time. The woman saw her first. The woman's eyes widened, and then, to her great credit, the woman did not gasp, did not exclaim, did not perform any of the small features that the situation invited. The woman simply set down her glass on the small folding table between them, and folded her hands in her lap, and waited. The Duchess approved of this, deeply, in the part of herself that kept private accounts. The Duke saw her second. He had been turned toward the woman mid-sentence, and he turned now toward the open door, and his face passed through 3 expressions in the space of 1 breath. First, the polite irritation of a man interrupted. Second, the slow, puzzled blank of a man recognizing a face he has not expected. Third, and this was the one the Duchess would remember, the small, quickly mastered flicker of a boy caught with a hand in a jar. He mastered it quickly. He was, after all, very good at being a duke. But she had seen it, and she had not been seeing it for 19 years, and so it counted, that night, as new information. "Eleanor," he said. She did not correct him. She did not say her grace, which would have been ironic, or my dear, which would have been cruel. She said nothing. She had decided, somewhere on the bridge, that she would let him fill the first silence himself, because she wished to know what he chose to put into it. He chose, after a moment, to put a question. "What in the name of heaven," he said, "are you doing here?" She considered the question. It was, she thought, an honest one, given his vantage point. She decided to answer it honestly. "I was driving," she said. He looked past her, at the empty driver's box, at the horses standing patient in the silver grass, at the cloak folded over her arm and the hat in her hand. She watched the arithmetic happen in his face. It took him longer than she had expected. She had always thought him quick. She revised, gently, downward. "You," he said. "Yes," she said. "The whole way," he said. "Yes," she said. "From the inn," he said. "From the inn," she said. He sat back. He did not, to his small credit, immediately become angry. He became, instead, something she had not seen in him before, which was uncertain. He looked at the woman beside him as if the woman might explain, and the woman, who had been raised, the Duchess suspected, by a sensible mother, declined to explain. The woman kept her hands folded and her eyes on the Duchess and waited. The Duchess liked her better with every passing second. She would have to do something about that later. She could not, in good conscience, allow herself to like a woman her husband had bought a house for. But the liking was there, and she would not pretend it was not. She was finished, that night, with pretending. "Eleanor," the Duke said again, "this is not a scene I wish to have on a road." He had recovered enough to attempt management. She admired the attempt, distantly. "No," she said. "I do not wish to have it on a road either. I wish to have it in the meadow, which is why I have driven us to one." He looked, for the first time, at the meadow. He looked at the mist. He looked at the moon. He looked back at her, and she saw, with the small grim satisfaction of a woman watching a balance come right after long arithmetic, that he had finally understood that this was not an accident. She gave him a moment to understand it fully. Then she held out the letter. She did not throw it. She did not brandish it. She held it out, the way one holds out a glove a guest has dropped. He looked at the letter. He recognized it. He did not take it. The woman beside him, who had not yet spoken to the Duchess directly, said, very quietly, "Your Grace, I did not know." The Duchess turned her eyes to her. They were steady. They had been practiced, like the voice, although for longer. "I believe you," she said. The woman's shoulders dropped a fraction. The Duke said sharply, "Eleanor, you cannot possibly." The Duchess turned back to him. She let the small word possibly sit between them in the cold air until it had withered a little. Then she said, "I can, in fact, possibly. I can possibly a great many things, Your Grace. It has been one of the most interesting discoveries of my evening." He stared at her. She let him stare. She had spent 19 years being stared past, and she was finding, on the whole, that being stared at was a great improvement. After a moment, he said, in a voice that had gone careful, "What do you want?" It was, she thought, the first useful question he had asked her in their marriage. She had prepared for it. She had not been sure he would ask it, but she had prepared, because preparation, she had learned long ago, was the only true privacy a woman of her position was permitted. "I want," she said, "3 things. I do not want a scene. I do not want a divorce. And I do not want, ever again, to be spoken of as a fair day." He flinched at the last one. So he had been listening to himself, she thought. Good. That was something. The woman, who had begun to gather her cloak about her with the small, precise movements of a person preparing to be gone from a room, paused and looked at the Duchess and said, "May I ask, Your Grace, what you do want?" The Duchess considered. The meadow was very quiet. The owl had stopped its case. The horses had dropped their heads to the grass. Somewhere far below, the river continued its complaint, undiscouraged. "I want," she said, "to be the one who drives when there is driving to be done. I want the house in the village to be put in my grandmother's name, which is also mine, and I want the key, and I want it not to be a secret. I want my husband to remember, when next he is tempted to describe me to a stranger, that strangers occasionally have ears, and that ears occasionally belong to people who think. And I want," she said, and here she allowed herself for the first time the smallest dry note, "to be toasted, if I am to be toasted, by my own name." There was a long silence. The Duke, who had been preparing several speeches, abandoned all of them, one after the other. The woman, who was not, after all, a fool, said, "Your Grace, I think I should walk back to the inn." The Duchess looked at her. "It is 3 miles," she said, "and the road is dark." The woman said, "I have walked further in worse company." The Duchess smiled, very faintly. It was the first smile she had permitted herself since the kitchen door had banged. "Take the lantern from the box," she said. "The boy at the inn will see you safely in. Tell him the Duchess sent you, and that there is to be tea, and that the partridges are not to be argued about further tonight." The woman inclined her head. She climbed down from the carriage with a neatness the Duchess approved of. She took the lantern. She paused at the edge of the lane and turned and said, "Your Grace, for what it is worth, I am sorry." The Duchess said, "I believe that too." The woman walked away down the lane, the lantern swinging gently, and the mist took her in, kindly, the way mist will. And after a little while there was only the small bobbing point of light, and then there was only the meadow, and the moon, and the Duke, and the Duchess, and the horses cropping grass. They drove home by the long road, the Duke inside the carriage, the Duchess on the box, because she had not, she informed him through the small forward window, finished with the reins, and because the horses, as he could surely see, had grown accustomed to her hand. He did not argue. He had, somewhere between the meadow and the river, lost the habit, for the evening at least, of arguing with her. He sat inside in a silence that was new to him, and that he did not yet know how to wear, the way a man wears a coat he has been given by someone he did not expect a gift from. She let him sit in it. She thought it would do him good. She did not press her advantage. She had learned, watching him manage other people for 19 years, that the worst thing one could do with a sudden advantage was to use it loudly. The quiet uses lasted longer. The dawn came up while they were still on the road. It came up the way fair days do, without fuss. A slow gray lightning that turned, by small degrees, into a thin pink, and then into a clean, honest gold that lay along the tops of the hedgerows and made the wet leaves shine. The Duchess watched it come. She had not watched a dawn from outside in a long time. She had watched many from her bedroom window, through glass, which is not the same. Through glass, a dawn is a picture. From the box of a carriage with the reins in your hands and the smell of wet hedge in your nose, and a husband behind you who has, perhaps for the first time, run out of charming things to say, a dawn is a fact. They reached the house as the kitchen chimneys were beginning to smoke. The grooms came out, startled to see her on the box, and she handed down the reins to the head groom, who had taught her, all those years ago, to click her tongue softly to a pony too large for her, and who looked at her now, just once, with an expression she did not entirely understand and did not need to. She climbed down. She handed him the cloak and the hat. She said, "See to them. They have done well." He said, "Your Grace, they have." She walked into her own house through the kitchen door because it was nearest, and because she had decided on the long road that she would no longer go the long way round inside her own walls. The cook, who was kneading bread, looked up and did not speak, and went on kneading, which the Duchess took as a courtesy of a high order. The Duke followed her in, slowly. He stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at the bread, looking at the cook, looking at his wife, as if he were not entirely certain which house he had arrived at. She turned to him. She said, "I shall have tea in the morning room. You may join me, if you wish, in half an hour." He opened his mouth. He closed it. He bowed, very slightly, the small, precise bow he used in court, and went away to wherever men go to consider what has happened to them. She drank her tea alone in the end. He did not come. She had not expected him to. She had expected him to need the morning to himself, and she had decided in the carriage that she would grant it to him, because grants of that kind, given freely, tend to be remembered. He came in the afternoon instead. He sat across from her at the small table by the window. He did not, she noticed, try to charm her. That was new. He said, "I have written to the village. The house will be in your grandmother's name by the end of the month. The key," he said, with a small, dry effort that she recognized as his own private courage, "will be on the hall table by Friday." She inclined her head. She did not thank him. Thanking him would have suggested that he had given her something rather than returned it. And she was, that day and ever after, finished with confusing the two. He sat for a moment, looking at the garden. Then he said, "Eleanor." She waited. He said, "The thing I said. About the weather." She waited. He said, "I did not know you were listening." She said, "I know." That, she said, was the difficulty. He nodded. He looked at his hands. He said very quietly, What would you have me say instead? She thought about it. The garden was full of the small, late roses that bloomed in their walled corner regardless of who was watching. The clock on the mantel, which had been her mother's, struck the hour with a soft, apologetic note, as if it did not wish to interrupt. I would have you say, she said, nothing about the weather at all. I would have you say, if you must speak of me to strangers, that I am a woman who can drive a carriage through the night and bring it home by the long road. That, she said, is true, and it is not flattery, and it is the kind of thing a person can live inside. He looked at her for a long moment. He did not, to his credit, attempt a clever answer. He said only, very well. He stood. He bowed, again, that small, precise bow, and this time, she thought, it was not for court. He went out. She finished her tea. The roses went on with their business. The clock struck the half. She sat in the warm square of sun by the window, and she allowed herself, finally, to feel the tiredness of the night, and it settled on her gently, the way a cat settles, without ceremony, certain of its welcome. It broke quietly then, the thing that had been holding her upright since the kitchen door had banged. It broke without sound. She did not weep. She did not need to. She only sat and breathed and watched the roses and felt, for the first time in 19 years, that she was at home in her own house, because she had, at last, arrived in it on her own terms. Of the others, in the small way of news that travels in such houses, there were ends to tell. The woman in the claret cloak walked the 3 miles to the inn that night, and the boy with the basket, who proved to be a young man of more sense than his employers, saw her safely to a fire and to a cup of tea and to a private room where no one asked her any questions, and in the morning she took the post-coach east, and she did not come back. She wrote a year later to the Duchess from a town by the sea where she had opened a small school for girls who could not afford the larger ones, and she said in the letter that she had thought often of what the Duchess had said in the meadow about being heard, and that she had decided to make a profession of it. The Duchess wrote back. She enclosed a sum that was not large enough to embarrass and not small enough to insult, and she said in the letter that she hoped the school would prosper, and that if it did not, the Duchess would consider it a personal failing and remedy it accordingly. The school prospered. The steward, who had argued with the cook about the partridges, and who had not, in the event, noticed that the carriage had left without him, was kept on, because the Duchess had decided that a steward who could be outwitted by a duchess in a driver's cloak was a steward who would be useful to her in the years to come. And so it proved. He never knew that he had been kept for that reason. He died, many years later, convinced that he had been indispensable, which the Duchess permitted because she had grown fond of him in a manner she could not have predicted. The cook went on arguing about partridges. The aunt who had cried at the wedding, when told a version of the story that omitted the most interesting parts, said only, "Well, dear, I always thought you were sensible." And the Duchess, who had once agreed with the aunt out of politeness, agreed with her again, this time out of accuracy. The head groom, who had taught a child of 7 to click her tongue softly to a pony too large for her, lived long enough to teach the same trick to the Duchess's first daughter, who learned it more quickly than her mother had, and who, in the way of daughters, took it entirely for granted. The horses, the 2 great bay geldings who had walked through a marriage one night without opinions, lived out their lives in the home pasture and were buried under the oak at the corner of it, which the Duchess visited, occasionally, with an apple in her pocket, out of habit. The Duke. Of the Duke there is less to say, and more, and both are true. He did not become overnight a different man. Such men do not. He became, by small degrees, a man who looked at his wife when she spoke, and who, when he spoke of her, chose his words as one chooses words for a person who might, at any moment, be listening from an unexpected seat. He did not write poems about her. She had not asked him to. He did, on the anniversary of the night in the meadow, every year for the rest of his life, raise a glass at his own table and say, "To my wife, who drives." He said it, the first time, with the small, dry effort of a man making amends. He said it the last time, with the simple ease of a man stating a fact he had grown proud of. The Duchess each year inclined her head and drank and said nothing, because she had learned by then that the best toasts are the ones that do not require an answer. And the house in the village, where her grandmother had lived as a girl, became, in time, a place she went when she wished to think clearly, which was often, and where the clock on the parlor mantel went on striking the hour with its soft, apologetic note, and where, in the kitchen garden, the south-facing wall obliged the late peas long past their season, and where, on summer evenings, she would sit on the bench by the well and listen to the village quiet itself for sleep, and feel, with the steady gratitude of a woman who had once been called a fair day and had decided on a road in the moonlight that fair days were enough, that she was, at last, at home in her own weather. And here, by the fire, we come to the end of the carriage and the meadow and the long road home. If you have ever sat at a table where you were spoken of as if you were not in the room, or driven a road in the dark with your hands steadier than your heart, or chosen, in a moment no one else noticed, to be the one who takes the reins, then this story has been about you, and you have always known it, and I am only the one who said it aloud. Tell me, before you go, which moment stayed with you? Was it the small bright sound of the glasses touching when he meant to drink to the wrong name? Was it the woman in the claret cloak, setting down her glass and folding her hands? Was it the Duchess in the meadow, holding out the letter she did not need to read again? Was it the toast, years later, at his own table, said at last to the right woman? Sit a while longer, if you can. There is another fire, and another story, and another carriage somewhere on another road, and I would be glad of your company when the kettle is ready again. Until then, sleep gently, travel kindly, and if anyone ever calls you a fair day, smile, and take the reins, and drive.